One of the main Illuminati secret society Freemasonic reasons for the revolution in Ethiopia was to stop the increasing liberation of Africa that was going on under the direction of and
Africa Ansabaraki Fertnesh Belem ተራሮች ላይ አምረሽ የተቀመጠ ሰው ሳትለምኝ እግዚአብሔር ሲመግብ እጆቿን ኢትዮጵያ ወደ እግዚአብሔር አንስታ
secret society Freemasonic reasons for the revolution in Ethiopia was to stop the increasing liberation of Africa that was going on under the direction of Haile Selassie, and the connection with the Illuminati behind the so-called New World Order and the Freemasonic global white supremacy conspiracy. Those are the real players in this. And let's begin this off like this. That the Illuminati, so-called Freemasonic, Luciferian Satanists, or some will call it global white supremacy, Anglo-American. There's many different names and subtitles and other categorizations of this plot and conspiracy. So from different sources you will hear different names being mentioned, but in order to simplify the view of this, when we say the Illuminati, because nowadays, because of all the media and all of the free speech access that certain people and institutions and other individuals and researchers and documentation now can get out there much more. Before, for the last 40 or so years, a lot of this information was suppressed. As the scripture even says that the truth, the truth will rise out of the earth. You know what I mean? So even though it's suppressed down to the ground, even though it's buried, that the truth still rises up. And what's beautiful about this particular time that we're living in is that a lot of our people are becoming much more acquainted with the so-called Illuminati and this conspiracy, so-called conspiracy, although it has been maligned as a so-called theory, but it's a reality, a conspiracy reality. But still, the half of the story hasn't been told, and the head cornerstone has been rejected. It says that the stone that the builder's rejected becomes the head of the corner. And this head cornerstone that we are speaking of and we are preaching of is Haile Selassie, the King of Kings. Now what's very interesting is that if you tie together the railway station speech and address of President John F. Kennedy, when John F. Kennedy met with Haile Selassie at the railway station and he introduced his Imperial Majesty and he spoke, if you get the entire speech and if you listen to it carefully, you will hear Kennedy state concerning the King of Kings, concerning Haile Selassie, that's because and due to his tireless efforts that 29 formerly colonized, and you see this is all a part of the Berlin Conference and the scramble for Africa and white supremacy in Africa. You understand that was going on and that had gone on ever since the Berlin Conference and Leopold and so forth and so on. That 29 African nations were freed. 29 African nations had overcome global white supremacy. In other words, they had overcome the Illuminati. They had overcome the so-called Freemasonic Eurocentric conspiracy against black people and against African peoples. So when Kennedy spoke at the railway station, he mentioned what he mentioned. He said 29 within less than a decade. Now a decade is 10 years. So in 10 years, 29 African nations were now free to stand up and speak as free human beings who were formerly under neo-colonialism or under white supremacy in Africa, and that Haile Selassie was the one who was responsible. Now, about 50 days after this particular speech and acknowledgement of the United States President, U.S. President John F. Kennedy, he would be assassinated in the Lone Star State. He would be assassinated in Texas. How very interesting all of this is. His Imperial Majesty is the first black man, the first head of state to sleep overnight as a guest in the White House at the same time. So when we look at that racist age, that overtly racist age that the 60s were, and we put all these pieces together, it gives us a credible evidence. I mean, real, indisputable evidence that points to the real reasons for the so-called creeping coup, or the so-called Ethiopian revolution that would occur roughly 4 to 5 years after that decade, after the 60s was out in 1974-75. So the real reasons behind the so-called creeping coup, or the godless and cruel dragon, the Luciferians, Illuminatis, the Freemasonic global white supremacy's coup against Ethiopia, and in particular against that which Haile Selassie represents, that 3,000-year Solomonic Davidic dynasty, that African Zion, becomes very much more clear to us. So the real reasons behind the Ethiopian revolution was to stop the southern movement of the revolution. As a revolution now, the effort was South Africa. If you listen to the speech of His Imperial Majesty at the United Nations, the Until the Philosophy speech, it then pointed on Angola, Mozambique, South Africa. That was the next target of freedom in Africa. And the Europeans, already seeing the work of God in Christ, already seeing the work of Edemawi Haile Selassie and those other faithful and patriotic leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah and Patrice Lumumba and other leaders, many of them who also suffered martyrdom. So we're looking at the 60s and we're seeing a time of martyrdom, and at the head of this is the conquering line of the tribe of Judah. Now, you either have to be biased, deceived, deluded, not to look at the Bible and see what Revelation is saying about the last days and the end times, and those who will be slain by the beast, and those who would be crucified, and those who Satan would target, and not put together Edemawi Haile Selassie and the other faithful and courageous Africans who were standing up for freedom, who were standing up for truth, who were standing up for justice, who were standing up for their own sovereignty and their own right to stand and to speak as free human beings. So it's very important for us to identify the real culprits, the real hidden, secret culprits that had worked behind careless Ethiopians in order to destroy Ethiopia, and in stopping Ethiopia, and in stopping the works that were done, hopefully in reversing the course of history, reversing the tide that was sweeping Africa. So the real reason for the so-called Ethiopia revolution was to stop the progress of African peoples. And when we look at the picture today, it seems as though it was successful. When we look at the African situation today, when we look at Ethiopia today, when we look at the carelessness today, when we look at the lack of knowledge, the fact that even among the high intellectuals, academics, and scholars and others, they have not put this together. They have not put together the so-called Illuminati and New World Order's agenda, which now has come to surface and come to light. And we see that this is not something new, but this is something that goes back hundreds, and some say thousands of years. And the Ethiopian revolution, and the real causes that many careless Ethiopians are just beginning to become concerned about, and begin to do their own research, and begin to see that, illness, no. Yes, this is true.